Ted Turner died on Wednesday at the age of 87. And in 2018, he revealed that he had been diagnosed with Lewy body dementia, which is the same disease that Robin Williams suffered from, ultimately led to the end of his life. It's a progressive brain disorder that causes all sorts of horrible things. The Terrorist Inside My Husband's Brain, that's the article that Robin's wife wrote after he died. I still remember reading it. If you care to do so, it's heartbreaking to read what he went through, all without knowing what it was that he even had. It wasn't until after he died that they even learned that he had the disease. But that's what Ted Turner had, and part of the reason, anyway, I would imagine why he lived the later years of his life out of the public eye, which stood in very stark contrast to the way he lived most of his life. Although he was 80 years old there, so, I mean, it's understandable that you would see him less and hear from him less. But this is a man who was dubbed the Mouth of the South for how outspoken he was, long before Jimmy Hart got the nickname. And he was best known, I'm sure you've seen it in a lot of the articles that have come out this week, best known for starting CNN, the first 24-hour news network at a time when none existed. He revolutionized the TV news industry. Revolutionized the TV industry, period. With his superstation TBS, Cartoon Network, Turner Classic Movies, the man built a media empire. Bought the Atlanta Braves to have programming for TBS back when it was still a local station and before it became TBS, which kept the team in Atlanta because there were strong rumors at the time that the owners may be looking to move the team out of the city. Turner bought them to keep them in Atlanta so that he could air the games on his station. He could broadcast them nationally from coast to coast, which really wasn't a thing at the time. You know, he also brought in Bobby Cox to manage the Braves not long after he bought the team, and then rehired him many years later, during which time the Braves won a World Series. Granted, they only won one. Just have to point that out. But they did win a World Series. Bobby Cox also died this week, which is more than a little eerie that the two of them both lived well into their 80s and they died within days of each other. So my condolences to all the Atlanta folks out there. You know, as a Mets fan, we had to contend with Bobby Cox for many years. It was very frustrating, although to be fair, he was very fortunate to have the kind of pitching that those Braves teams had. But he is the greatest manager in the history of that franchise. Ted Turner is the one who hired him and then fired him and then hired him back. And Turner did the same thing. He bought the Atlanta Hawks to keep them in Atlanta. He gifted $1 billion to the United Nations to form the United Nations Foundation because he believed that international engagement was necessary for the sake of humanity. And whatever you think of the UN, he clearly believed in its cause. No one pledges $1 billion of their personal wealth to something that they don't believe in very strongly. He created the Turner Foundation, which provided grants to support environmental causes. He co-created the Captain Planet character. I'm sorry to say, the first time I even really knew of Captain Planet was through some of the sketches on Robot Chicken. I wasn't really a Captain Planet guy, I guess, but he co-created Captain Planet. He rescued American bison from near extinction. All that to say, he wasn't just a one-trick pony. He wasn't just a media executive. He wasn't just the owner of a baseball team. He had his hands in a lot of different things, and he put his money where his mouth was, even though his mouth got him into trouble more than a few times. You'll notice the one thing I haven't even mentioned yet was his ties to pro wrestling. Because in the grand scheme of things, his involvement in wrestling was like a tiny sliver of his life. Wrestling only gets a passing mention in his book. And yet, without exaggeration, he will go down as one of the single most important figures in the history of pro wrestling. So much so that even WWE gave him a graphic on SmackDown. You know, there was a time where that never would have happened. But a certain someone ain't there no more. I still wasn't sure they would acknowledge his death, so that was actually a pleasant surprise to see that. On Dynamite, AEW had a very classy tribute with Tony Schiavone in the ring with Sting, two people who were synonymous with that era when wrestling was on TBS, and then later on, you know, on TNT in the Nitro days. Schiavone was the voice of the company, and Sting was the face of it, him and Ric Flair. But there's a reason that they called Sting the franchise. He was the one guy who never left for WWE, not until many years after WCW was dead and buried. But Tony spoke, Sting spoke, they gave him a 10-bell salute on TBS. It just felt right. Pro wrestling is not where it is today without Ted Turner. If he was not a fan of wrestling, if he didn't invest in it the way that he did, I don't know what wrestling looks like today. But it's probably not as big as it is. Now, I mentioned him airing Braves baseball on what would later become TBS, but he also snatched Georgia Championship Wrestling away from a rival station. This was back in the early 70s, and it did big numbers for him, so he added even more of it. And it was still a local station back then, but a few years later, they started beaming it out on satellite, which is how people across the country had access to it, right? Hence the idea of it becoming a superstation. And wrestling was the first show on cable to hit 1 million viewers. It was very popular. And then there was Black Saturday in 1984. And if you've listened to this podcast for any length of time, you've heard me talk about Black Saturday. I even did a Dark Side of the Ring review on the episode devoted to Black Saturday and the rise of Vince McMahon. The only show outside of WWE, which was airing on USA Network at the time. And there had been another wrestling show on USA Network. WWF got the slot. But the only other show outside of Vince that had national cable was Georgia Championship Wrestling on TBS. And so Vince made an offer to Ted Turner to buy out the slot, and Turner rejected him. So you can trace all of Vince's animosity towards Ted Turner back to this moment. Someone had the audacity to say no to him, right? You don't do that. You don't say no to Vince McMahon. But there was a lot of turmoil behind the scenes with GCW at the time. Business was falling, and Ole Anderson is wondering, where's the money going? There was a lot of shady shit going on behind the scenes. Jack and Jerry Briscoe and some of the other shareholders in Georgia had a secret meeting with Vince McMahon behind Ole's back. They never told Ole, because Ole did not want to sell, let alone to Vince. And behind his back, they used their majority voting power to add a bylaw that the company could be sold without informing all of the shareholders or even allowing them to match any outside offers. So they sold their stock to Vince. And that led to Black Saturday on TBS, where fans tuned in one morning, expecting to see Gordon Solie's face, and instead they were greeted by Vincent Kennedy McMahon, who even brought Gorilla Monsoon to the studio with him that day, I guess in case somebody wanted to kick his ass. He had Gorilla there with him as backup, or at least so says Jerry Briscoe. No studio audience that people were used to seeing, no live matches. It was just Vince tossing it to a bunch of taped WWF matches from around the country with his guys. And the fans were not happy about this. They flooded the phone lines. They were expressing their outrage. Vince didn't give a fuck about GCW. He just wanted the time slot for his wrestlers. And he kept that slot for about a year. Ratings went down. Turner worked out a deal with Bill Watts to put Mid-South Wrestling on TBS in a different time slot, which did better numbers than Vince's show did. And so Vince kind of saw the writing on the wall. He figured Turner was about to cancel the show. He worked out a deal to sell the slot to Jim Crockett Jr. for $1 million, which he famously told Crockett, "I'm going to make you choke on that $1 million." And then you fast forward to 1988, Crockett's in debt. He's about to shut down his promotion. He's on the verge. He's on the brink. And Ted Turner buys the company from him. Not because the other executives who worked for Turner wanted him to buy a wrestling company, quite the contrary. But because Ted Turner had a loyalty. He felt this sense of loyalty to wrestling, which had been so instrumental in the early success of TBS. Even when the company was losing money in the early 90s, and WCW lost a lot of money. There were executives at Turner Broadcasting in his ear telling him, sell it or shut it down. He refused. He didn't want to hear it. And they were losing millions, right? Not as many millions as they would lose later on. But still, if they were losing $5 million a year, $8 million a year, it's a lot of money, especially back then. And it sucks too, because 1992 was an incredible year for WCW that I didn't fully appreciate at the time, because I wasn't watching it as much as I was watching the other product. But I go back now, and man, even now on the WCW channel, it's like the WCW Vault that they have on YouTube. And you look at some of the stuff they upload from 92 and even 93, and you look at the talent roster that they had back then, the matches they were producing, that is some of the best stuff that WCW ever put out in the history of that company. And yet they were losing so much money. But Ted Turner is the man who signed off on Eric Bischoff bringing Hulk Hogan into WCW. That was the first real shot fired as far as trying to compete with Vince McMahon, because they had just signed away Vince's biggest star. Now, he wasn't working for Vince anymore. It's not like he kind of in the middle of the night, he went and raided Vince's top guy. Hogan had been Vince's top guy for many years. But at that point, he was doing Thunder in Paradise. He wasn't wrestling anymore. Still, though, he signed away Vince's biggest star, who Vince had thought was on the downswing, trying to phase him down, phase him out, right? Oh, he's washed. Doesn't have as much value left. That's why he shifted to the new generation model with guys like Bret Hart and Shawn Michaels. And he wasn't wrong. I mean, he had to create new stars. And Hogan was very passé to a lot of people. But to say he had no value, I mean, to say that Randy Savage, who Vince also had no interest in anymore and using in a major way, had no value as a draw, was crazy. And so in 1995, Hogan's there, Savage is there. Turner wants to know, why are our ratings lower than WWE? And he asked Eric Bischoff, what do we need to do to compete with them? And Eric said, well, they're in prime time on Monday nights. So Turner said, okay, give Eric an hour in prime time every Monday night on TNT. And thus WCW Monday Nitro was born. Nitro did not expand to 2 hours until the following year. It was actually Memorial Day in 1996, the same night that Scott Hall showed up. That's when Nitro officially moved to 2 hours. It may be that the 2 hours that Eric always refers to in that meeting, Ted said give Eric 2 hours. The only thing I could think of is maybe when he says this, unless, again, he's just forgetting, is they did give WCW a replay every Monday night. There was a Nitro replay that would air the same night a few hours later. So it was the same show, but it was like the second hour technically was a replay. You hear him tell it, though, you would think Ted gave him 2 hours of first-run television every Monday night right out of the gate. That's not the case. It was almost a year before the show would move to 2 hours. And Turner, more or less, was hands-off after that. When it came to WCW, he would check in on the ratings with Eric every Tuesday. When the Nielsen numbers would come out, usually Tuesday, like late afternoon. But he left Bischoff to his own devices. And Eric he talked to Ariel Helwani this week about Turner's death. And he said that any decision up to $1 million, he did not even need to consult anybody at Turner. He did not have to ask for permission or approval. He just went and did it. If it was over $1 million, if it was $1.1 million, he would have to run it up the flagpole. But he basically had an open checkbook from Turner to sign whoever he felt he needed or make whatever changes he felt were necessary. And it was that Turner money that brought in Hogan and Nash and Savage and Hall and all of these different people. But like Hogan, Hall, and Nash, obviously that led to the creation of the NWO. And the creation of the NWO changed the business forever. And it led to WCW kicking WWE's ass for 83 straight weeks in the ratings. They took WCW from a regional promotion, losing millions of dollars, to the number one promotion in the world, making millions for a good 2 years or so before it all started to fall apart. I mentioned, again, they didn't lose as much money in the early 90s as they did in the late 90s. They got to a point where they lost over $60 million in 1 year. That is quite the swing. To go from being the number one promotion making millions to losing $60 million, I mean, that's quite the downfall. But Ted Turner is the only man to take the fight directly to Vince McMahon and kick his ass in a way that nobody else had done. And this irritated Vince like you wouldn't believe. Turner lived rent-free in this man's head. Vince always talked about it like he was at war directly with Ted Turner, when the reality was Ted Turner spent very little time even thinking about Vince McMahon or really thinking about wrestling in general. Like, Vince liked to think that he was more important than he really was outside of wrestling. And he couldn't stand that Turner was this big, successful media mogul, but it's the story of Vince's life. He was always seeking validation outside of wrestling. Wrestling was a dirty word to him, right? He couldn't stand just being known as a wrestling promoter. And he failed each and every time outside of it, whether it was movies or football or bodybuilding supplements. I guarantee you there's still a warehouse full of IcoPro bottles in Connecticut somewhere. But Bischoff, using Turner's money, made lots of changes that Vince had no choice but to respond to and to adapt to. Where do you think In Your House pay-per-views came from? WCW started running monthly pay-per-views, so Vince followed suit. And then eventually he expanded those shows from 2 hours to 3 hours because that's what WCW was doing. Bischoff made sure Nitro had a real modern look and feel to it. Much better than what Raw looked like back then. Raw looked like shit compared to Nitro. In those early days, are you kidding me? And I say that as a WWF fan at the time, who watched a lot more Raw than I did Nitro. But Nitro just looked cooler. And I always loved it when they would air the show outdoors at Universal or in Panama City Beach, outside for those spring break shows. WWF wasn't doing anything like that. So what happened? We got Raw is War with the giant Titantron to update the look of the show. All right, Bischoff brought in the cruiserweights, which were one of the highlights of Nitro every week. Eventually, Vince started bringing in cruiserweights and international stars, and he made a big deal about signing Taka Michinoku and had a press conference. And you think he did all that shit because he suddenly fell in love with those guys? Eric made Nitro live every week. Eventually, Vince did the same. He had to. Eric was giving out spoilers for Raw on Nitro every week. That used to piss me off like you wouldn't believe. Because the first hour of Nitro was, early on anyway, was unopposed to Raw when it was 2 hours. So I would tune into Nitro, and Bischoff was still doing commentary at the time, and he'd be sitting there going, all right, and on the other show, the big guy is going to eat a super kick from the little guy. I'm like, you motherfucker. This is what would happen every single week. Everything Bischoff and WCW did, Vince followed suit, and he tried to do it better. It motivated him to stop doing the same old shit. This is why you need competition. This is why competition is so... there's a lot of reasons why competition is important, obviously for the talent as well, but that's one of the reasons. Because when you get lazy and you get complacent, you need somebody else to come along and do it better than you. Because nobody wants to look bad. Nobody wants to be shown up by somebody else. Competition is the great motivator. And Vince would always portray himself as the victim, right? He was, I'm not a billionaire with an open checkbook like Billionaire Ted was, right? That's where the Billionaire Ted skits came from. Like I said, rent-free. Vince would write letters to Turner admonishing him for letting his wrestlers blade on television. He called it barbaric. And then he turned right around a few years later and he allowed his wrestlers to blade every week in the Attitude Era. I guess it was no longer barbaric to him. Only when somebody else did it was it barbaric. At a time when his product was more family-friendly. So it wasn't that he found it barbaric. It was that it's not fair that you can do it and we can't. So if we can't do it, then nobody should be allowed to do it. All the letters he wrote to Turner, some of which have been published over the years, all the letters that he wrote to Ted Turner, I doubt Ted Turner ever responded to a single one of them. I don't even know if they made it to his desk. Meanwhile, all the things that he used to criticize and mock Turner for when it came to throwing his money around and being a billionaire, Vince did the exact same thing. Even before he became a billionaire. Like, just go back to the territory days. All the talent that he raided from other promotions. You think Hulkamania started in WWE? He nationalized it. He made it global. But that shit started in the Twin Cities with Vern Gagne. Hulkamania, Mean Gene Okerlund, Bobby the Weasel, Jesse Ventura, on and on, all those guys, they were stars in the AWA before Vince signed them all. But yet he turns around in the 90s and he cries about Turner making money on the backs of stars that he created. Fast forward 25 years, he's throwing high six figures and seven-figure contracts at guys who he would never give that kind of money to just to keep them from signing with AEW. He didn't mind throwing his money around then. And that's his right to do that. But the hypocrisy is just, it's so glaring. Not that Turner did anything wrong in his eyes. It's that somebody had the gall to do it to him. That's really what that was all about. But then it all came crashing down with, the worst media merger in history in the year 2000, the infamous AOL Time Warner merger. Turner lost all of his power after that. As I said before, WCW lost over $60 million. And at that point, there was nothing he could do to save it. He had always vowed to keep wrestling on his TV stations no matter what, but he wasn't in charge anymore. He lost control of all of his assets. Turner Broadcasting, CNN, the Braves, all of it. He lost billions of dollars. There was a period where he discussed the possibility of starting a new wrestling company. A bunch of people got together with him, and the idea was that they would start a new company. They would get it back on TNT or TBS, but he was told that it would take about $50 million to get it off the ground and really compete with Vince McMahon. And it's not that he didn't have the money, although he had a lot less money. It's not that he didn't have the money, but he didn't have as much of it as he used to, and he wasn't willing to make that kind of investment. So he said no, and that was, as far as his involvement in the wrestling world goes, that's pretty much where it came to an end. So, I mean, he should be a shoo-in for any wrestling Hall of Fame, just based on the influence that he had alone. From putting it on his station in the 70s, buying Crockett Promotions in the 80s, starting the Monday Night War in the 90s. Honestly, outside of Vince McMahon and Hulk Hogan, name me a more influential figure business-wise in the history of pro wrestling. There is none. And you know what? After Vince, because Vince is number one, but after Vince, if you wanted Turner at number 2 and Hogan at number 3, I wouldn't argue it. I wouldn't argue either one of those positions. But I would say this. For someone as divorced from the day-to-day of the wrestling business as Ted Turner was, someone who didn't live it and breathe it every single day, he sure did leave his mark on it.